Well, good morning again. I know you've ever noticed that parents, grandparents have a very strange relationship with their kids and food. You can buy a child a full Happy Meal. You pay for it, the drink, the fries, even the little toy that comes with it. You carry the table to the, or carry the tray to the table. You put it all out. You peel all the ketchup and you make sure they have what they need, that they get their napkins, they get the right drink, right? And then you reach over to take a fry, right? I call it the French fry tax. And suddenly your child looks at you like you've committed a federal crime. Papa, those are mine. Mine. Right now you want to say, or I want to say, you probably don't, but I want to say, excuse me, yours? Let's just kind of review the facts here, right? I'm the one who decided to come. I'm the one who drove you here. I'm the one who paid for the food, that did the work to raise the money to pay for the food, who stood in line, who brought it here, that set it up in front of you, made sure that you got the right toy that you wanted, right? I'm not stealing your fries. I'm simply receiving a small tribute for what I deserve. Now, of course, don't do this because there's no way they're going to get it. Trust me, because I've tried. Because the fries are in front of them, there's a basic belief that they must belong entirely to me. They are mine. Now, most of you all have been in church long enough to know where this leads, right? This is how we are with God. God gives us life, breath, strength, opportunities. He provides, He protects, He sustains, He blesses. As crazy as things have been here in our country, it's actually been relatively a really good 250 years. It really has. And yet we often focus outwardly. We focus on the other things. And then when God, after providing all those great things, invites us to give back a portion of what He's already given, sometimes there's something in us that wants to say, but Lord, these are my fries. This is mine, mine, mine. Or at least maybe that's just me. In the next 4 out of this next 6 weeks, we're going to interweave it with some other great things. We're going to look at this issue. There is a time, and we purposely took it before the sermon. This is not meant to guilt you into giving, kind of a thing. It's just as we're talking about what it means to follow Christ, this is one of the things that we need to talk about as Christians. We're going to look at this issue. We say we're going to take our tithes and offerings. And for most of you that have been in church a while, you just kind of shake your head and move on. But I think for a lot of folks, you don't use the word tithe very often, if at all, in your everyday life. Taxes, we understand, but not a tithe. And so we're going to talk about it, exactly what it is, and like I say, for the next 6 weeks. We're going to trace it through the scriptures. We're going to talk about the tithe before the law. We're going to talk about the tithe that's actually codified in the Old Testament law, the Hebrew scriptures. We're going to talk about Jesus and the tithe, and then finally we'll talk about the church and the tithe. And you're an extra blessing because this series really makes sense as a whole rather than in part. And so being here at the beginning will be an advantage for you. Now, let me just be clear. The goal is not to create guilt-driven giving. We're not doing this series because we looked at our budget and went, oh my, we need help. So go preach on it. Okay? What we're hoping is that we learn, or that this series helps us to grow, to understand that where our treasure is, that our heart is, and that our hearts will grow, that we'll place our trust into God, and our lives will be expanded because of that. So let's start with the basic question, all right? What is a tithe? The tithe simply means a tenth. That's what it literally means, a tenth. So in short, to tithe is to give a tenth of what one has received. So in simplest terms, if you receive $10, you give $1 to the Lord. Now, when the tithe was instituted, it wasn't dollars. They didn't have a monetary system. It was if you have 10 lambs, you give 1 lamb. If you have 10 oranges, you give 1 orange, and so on and so on and such forth. Okay, that's what a tithe is. In the Bible, the tithe does eventually become part of the law. It was a rule that Moses connected to the worship life of Israel, of the country of Israel. The support of the Levites, that's the priests, and the care of their community at large. But before we get to the law, before we get to Moses, who instituted the tithe officially, before we get to the tabernacle where they worshiped, before we get to the Levitical priesthood, which it supported, right? We find the tithe already in the scriptures. And this is important because when people hear the word tithe, they often immediately begin to wonder, okay, they begin to ask the question, is this required? Do I have to? Is there an Old Testament law? Or is it just an Old Testament thing? Does this apply to Christians? Great questions, important questions, and we will deal with each of those questions, but they're not really the first question, at least that the Bible asks. Before we ask, do I have to tithe, we should probably ask a deeper question. Have I forgotten who bought the fries? Because before the tithe was ever commanded in the law, it appeared as a voluntary act of worship, of gratitude, of trust in response to God's blessing. That means the tithe is not first introduced to us as a cold religious rule. It's introduced as a heart response. It's connected to people who are recognizing that God has blessed them, He's protected them, He's provided for them, and He has delivered them. So to see this, we're going to look at three primary passages today. Abram in Genesis 14, Jacob in Genesis 28, and then we are going to go to Hebrews 7, which goes back to the Genesis 14 passage. So first, let's look at Abram. All right, Abram's tithe, giving a tenth, was a response to God's blessing. It was a response to God's blessing. So let me give you the background. In Genesis 14, it's the first mention of the tithe. But here's the context. It's a rescue mission. All right? Earlier in Genesis there are several kings that are from the east that defeat the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah, the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. Right? In the process, Abram's nephew Lot and his family are taken captive along with all the loot of the area. And then when Abram hears that his nephew Lot has been taken, he gathers trained men and he pursues the invading kings and he defeats them. And he brings them back, a lot back, and the people and the possessions. And Abram returns from the battle victorious. And as he returns, he meets two kings on the way back, right? So all these people and all the possessions were taken. He conquers the enemy. He's bringing back the people and the possessions. And he meets these two kings. One is Melchizedek, the king of Salem, and the other one is the king of Sodom. We don't know his name. But these two kings are very different. And Abram's response to each one teaches us something important about the tithe before the law. So let's first look at Abram's response to Melchizedek, which is the passage you see before you. Genesis 14, verses 18 through 20. It says this, Then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was priest of God Most High. And he blessed Abram, saying, Blessed be Abram by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, and praise be to God Most High, who delivered your enemies into your hand. Then Abram gave him a tenth of everything. So, first of all, his name will be changed to Abraham. So yes, it's the one and the same, Abram and Abraham. As a matter of fact, I might go back and forth, and so you know I'm talking about the same person, okay? So he runs into this king called Melchizedek. Now, the interesting thing about Melchizedek is he just shows up out of nowhere. We don't know. This is the only passage that really talks about him. And these are the facts that we know. He's a king, and he's a king specifically of Salem, which, by the way, will later become Jerusalem. Salem, Jerusalem. And he's a priest, meaning, remember what we said a priest? The priest represents the people to God and God to the people. He's the priest before the priesthood has even been established. We don't know how. We don't know. There's no story about him. There's no background. There's none of that. There's none of that. But he shows up on the scene. Here he is. And he brings out bread and wine to Abram and his men, right? Because they've just returned from battle and they're famished and they're tired and they've been running a long time. And he meets them with provision and blessing. And then he pronounces a blessing. First, he blesses Abram. You'll see here, right? He says, blessed be Abraham by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth. And then he blesses God. And praise be to God Most High, who delivered your enemies into your hand. So after ministering to their physical needs, he gives a blessing. But notice, I want you to notice here what Melchizedek is doing. He helps Abram interpret the victory. See, he could have come back, Abraham could have come back from battle and said, hey, look what I've done. Look how strong I am. Look how brave I am. Look how capable my household is. Look how strategic my plan was. As a matter of fact, he probably could have done conferences. 3 steps to return, Yes. But Melchizedek says, hey, Abram, this victory came from the God. It was he that delivered your enemies into your hands. Abram fought, but God delivered. Abram acted, but God gave the victory. Abram pursued, but God was the source of success. And because of this, Abram responds, the very last part of this here. Then Abram gave a tenth of everything. So all that he had, whether he brought it with him or whether he captured it in terms of the goods, he gave Melchizedek a tenth. Out of the blue. Before the law, before Moses, before there's a formal system, there's nothing that we see in scriptures before this suggests that he has to do this or should do this. He gives a tenth simply out of response to God's blessing. He's not paying a tax. He's not checking off a religious box. He's not presented as Abraham trying to earn God's favor. He's not like, hey, I'm going to do this, this kind of spiritual Ponzi scheme. We're often sold. You give and God's going to give you 100-fold back. It's not that. It's not that. God's already blessed. God's already delivered. God's already given the victory. But his response is one of worship, of gratitude, of recognition. Abram is saying, God, you are the one who gave the victory. You are the one who delivered. You are the one who reigns over heaven and earth. What I have is not ultimately because of me. What I have is because of you. This is the foundation of biblical giving. Not guilt, not you better, not look what you can get out of it. Giving is not first about what God needs from us. He's the possessor of heaven and earth. He does not need anything from us, as though he were lacking. Giving is about what we need to acknowledge about God. When we give, we're saying, God, you are the source. That is why Abram's tithe matters. His tithe declares that God was his provider. But the historical account doesn't end there. It's very important in the second king, verses 21 through 24. The king of Sodom, and we're going to find out later that Sodom and Gomorrah were not great cities, so this was not a great king. Okay? The king of Sodom said to Abram, give me the people and keep the goods for yourself. But Abram said to the king of Sodom, with a raised hand, I have sworn an oath to the Lord, God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, that I will accept nothing belonging to you, not even a thread or a strap of a sandal, so that you will never be able to say, I made Abram rich. I will accept nothing but what my men have eaten and the share that belongs to the men who sent with me to Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre. Let them have their share. See, after Abram gives a tenth to Melchizedek, the king of Sodom speaks to Abram, and he says, give me the people and keep the goods for yourself. And in fact, he's saying, Abram, we had so many great people taken. We are just so thankful. You can keep the plunder. You can keep the possessions that were taken from us. You can keep the goods. And this would have made Abram wealthy. And it would have been easy for Abram to justify. He risked his life. He fought the battle. He rescued the people. He recovered the goods. And now the king of Sodom is offering Abram freely the plunder out of thanks. But Abram refuses. Now, I don't know if this is a spiritual principle that is for all time. You should refuse anything from a pagan king. We actually don't see that in scriptures. Somehow, he was either impressed upon Abram's heart from his view of what God was doing, or God impressed upon his heart. But what he does, he says this, right? With a raised hand, I have sworn an oath. In other words, I'm not going to take the smallest thing from you. Why? Because Abram does not want the king of Sodom to take credit for making him prosper. He wants it clear where his source is. It's clear. That is powerful. That is powerful. How many times do we want something for God and we feel like we've got to make it happen? The problem with making it happen is we go around taking the credit. Or how many times do we get frustrated because we ask God to do something and he waits until it's evident it's not going to happen until he does it? Drives me nutty. But it's God's way, at least in my life. It's God's way of reminding me it was me and not you. Because when he does it early, guess who takes the credit often? Me. Me. I have nobody to blame but myself. Abram had already received a blessing from Melchizedek in the name of the God Most High. He had already given tenth as response to God's blessing. Now he refuses the wealth of Sodom because he does not want there to be any confusion about the source of his blessing. He wants his life to say, God the Most High, who owns it all, is the one who blessed me. Now he does take what's appropriate, right? There's food that was already consumed by his men. There were 3 other leaders, right, who helped him out there. He took their share. I'm not sure what that appropriate share was, but he took that. He obviously had already given a tenth to Melchizedek, so he took that. He did not deny others what was rightfully theirs. He did not commit on their behalf, but he committed on his behalf, not to be enriched by the king. And his tithe and his refusal go together, because it's not just about, did you give to the church? They go together. By giving a tenth to Melchizedek, Abraham declares God gave the victory. It wasn't mine, it was his. By refusing the goods of Sodom, he declares God alone will get the credit for my blessing, which, by the way, is not completely come. It will, but it's not completely come. So notice this, and this is, by the way, in your notes on the app, okay? Tithing is not merely about what we give, it's about who we trust. You could just chew on that a while. Tithing is not merely about what we give, it's about who we trust. And that's why Jesus says, where your treasure is, there your heart is. He's saying, I just want you to know what you trust, what you really depend on, what you really value, that's where your treasure is. Abraham trusted God to be his provider. He trusted God to bless him without needing the wealth of Sodom. He trusted that God who delivered his enemies could also provide his future. Before the tithe becomes law, not with obligation, he responds with worship. Not with pressure, but with gratitude. Not with fear, but with faith. But with faith. Abraham's tithe was a response to God's blessing. Abraham's tithe declared that God was his provider. However, the second mention of the tenth before the law is different. It comes in Genesis 28. Jacob's tithe was a vow of trust and thankfulness. Coming. This time the setting is very, very different. So let me explain to you the setting here. Because Jacob promises a tenth in the middle of fear, displacement, and uncertainty. So this takes place in the middle of Jacob is running for his life from his home. He has deceived his father, Isaac, and he cheated his brother out of a blessing. His brother was supposed to get a blessing. His father was blind. Some of you all might remember this story. And in cahoots, actually, with his mother, they kind of fool the father in giving him the blessing. Now, we know from the beginning of the story this was God's intention. Not necessarily it was right to deceive, but God knew that this was going to happen. But Esau, who's a big, burly guy you don't want to mess with, is livid. And so Jacob leaves believing Esau is going to take him out. And so he runs from his home. And this isn't a day and time. We move all the time. We move away from our folks. This is a day and time where people almost never left their community. It was very, very rare. Only under extreme economic circumstances would someone leave their community. And here he is on his own. He's alone. He's displaced. He's uncertain about his future. And he's leaving home because of a family conflict and because of his own deception, his own mistakes. On the way, he stops for a night and he uses a stone for a pillow. just kind of propped it up a little bit. And he falls asleep. And then that night, he has a dream. Okay? And so you guys can see in the picture a little bit on the right there, it's the stairway to heaven. Right? I know you have the song stuck in your head now. I'm sorry. All right? And what he dreams about is this ladder from earth to heaven, and angels ascending and descending in it. And in the dream, God appears to Jacob in this dream and repeats the promise that he had given to Abraham and Isaac, Jacob being Isaac's son. And God promises Jacob the same thing. He promises him a land, he promises him descendants, and he promises that the earth, all peoples, will be blessed through his offspring. That's the Messiah, hint, hint. He promises him protection, his presence. And he says, behold, I'm with you, and I will keep you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land, because that was the land he had promised. So Jacob wakes up and realizes something stunning. Surely the Lord was in this place. He thought he was alone, but God was there. He thought he was simply running, but God was actually leading. He thought he was sleeping in an ordinary place, but God met him there. So Jacob takes that stone, he uses a pillow, and he sets it up as a pillow. He pours oil on it, and it becomes a sign, a marker, a memorial. It marks the place where God met him. It marks the place where God spoke and where Jacob received the promise of God's presence. And in the midst of this, he makes a vow. So we pick that up in Genesis chapter 28, verses 20 through 22. It says, then Jacob made a vow. You'll notice this if-then relationship here. He made a vow saying, if God will be with me and will keep me on this journey that I take and will give me food to eat and garments to wear, and I return to my father's house in safety, then the Lord will be my God. Now, it wasn't, by the way, just so you know, it wasn't when he completes his entire list, then we'll talk, right? It was if he provides all along the way, he's going to be my God. This stone, which I've set up as a pillar, will be God's house, and all of that you give me, I will surely give a tenth to you. Now, Jacob is a very immature person of faith. It takes him a long time to grow. There's still a lot of road ahead of him. He's still learning. He's still being shaped. He's still going to grasp and scheme and lie, and he's got a lot to learn. But in this moment, he recognizes his dependence on God. He understands he's in trouble without the God of his father and grandfather. He cannot protect himself. He cannot provide for himself. He cannot guarantee his safe return. He cannot fulfill the covenant promise that God just gave him on his own strength. So Jacob makes a vow. If God does what God has promised to do, and it's not a smooth road, if God keeps him, provides for him, brings him safely home, then Jacob, it says there, will give him a tenth that God blesses him with. All that you give me, I will surely give a tenth to you, a tithe to you. See, Jacob understands that anything he has will have to come from God. That's why it's all that you give me. He's already stating ahead of time, by the way. Unlike Abraham, where it was already provided, Jacob's looking ahead and stating anything that you provide, food is going to come from you. Clothing is going to come from you. Protection is going to come from you. Safe return, future blessing. His tithe was a vow of trust and thankfulness. And notice the contrast here. So Abram's tithe looked backward at a victory God had already given. Jacob's tithe looked forward in trust to a provision God would give. Two different places. Abram's tithe said, God delivered me. Jacob's tithe said, God must sustain me. Abram's tithe was gratitude after the battle. Jacob's tithe was trust for the journey. Both are important. I wouldn't say one's greater than the other. Sometimes we give because we're looking back and saying, God, you have been faithful. Sometimes we give because we are looking ahead and saying, God, I believe that you are good and you will be faithful. Sometimes giving is a testimony of gratitude. Sometimes giving is a declaration of trust. Jacob is not giving from a place of strength. He's making this vow from a place of weakness. I think this is really, really important. He's not surrounded by plunder from battle. He's sleeping with a stone for a pillow. He's not returning home victorious. He's leaving home actually afraid. But even there, he says, God, if you give, I will give back to you. That is the heart of the tithe before the law, before it's a rule. It's not merely about abundance, it's about acknowledgement. Acknowledgement. It acknowledges God as the giver. We are standing in victory like Abram, or we might be lying in vulnerability like Jacob. Now, I want to jump ahead to Hebrews chapter 7, verses 1 through 10. We're not going to spend a whole lot of time here, but because it's contextual, it's important. I want to touch on it. So let me just read you these 10 verses. This Melchizedek, so he's looking back at the Genesis 14 passage, was king of Salem and priest of God Most High. He met Abraham returning from the defeat of the kings and blessed him. And Abraham gave him a tenth of everything. First, the name Melchizedek, so now he breaks down the Hebrew, means king of righteousness. Then also king of Salem means king of peace. Without father or mother, without genealogy, in other words, we don't know anything about him, without beginning of days or end of life, he resembles the Son of God. He remains a priest forever. In other words, we have no record when he became a priest. We had no record, that he's not going to be a priest. And so he kind of points to Jesus. Just think, verse 4, how great he was. Talking about Melchizedek. Even the patriarch Abraham gave him a tenth of the plunder. Now the law requires the descendants of Levi, that's one of the 12 sons, they were all the ones who became priests to collect a tenth from the people, that is, from their fellow Israelites. We'll talk about that next week. Even though they are also descended from Abraham. This man, however, did not trace his descendants from Levi, because he was before. Yet he collected a tenth from Abraham and blessed him who had the promises. And without doubt, the lesser is blessed by the greater. In other words, the top person usually blesses the other person. In the one case, the tenth is collected by people who die, but in the other case, being the Levites died, by him who's declared to be living. One might even say that Levi, who collects the tenth, paid the tenth through Abraham, because Abraham gave, because when Melchizedek met Abraham, Levi was still in the body of his ancestor. In other words, a coming descendant. All that is technicality. Here's the major point, okay? Don't get lost. Just focus in on me. You can study that later, okay? Hebrews 7 points us from Melchizedek to Jesus. That's the important thing. It points us from Melchizedek to Jesus. It looks back at Genesis 14 and reflects on Melchizedek. And he uses Genesis 14 to show us the greatness of Melchizedek's priesthood, which again, we have no context for. All we know, and for what you need to understand is that for the Jewish people, Abraham and Moses are like what for a Catholic the Pope would be. All that and then some, right? All that and then some, especially if it was a good Pope. All right? And so there was no one greater than Moses and Abraham. And yet here we have Abraham who is, in essence, giving way, this is his point, giving way to this other, the king of Salem, Melchizedek, therefore making him the greater one. That's his major point. Melchizedek is the one who braces Abraham. And Abraham then, in response, gives a tenth. He wants to give a tenth to God, but he gives it to Melchizedek, again, showing his greatness. And the writer of Hebrews says that the lesser is blessed by the greater. That means Melchizedek is presented as greater than Abraham in this moment. So Hebrews, the writer of Hebrews, who we're not completely clear on who wrote it, uses this to show that Melchizedek's priesthood is greater than the Levitical priesthood, right? The official, in modern day context, it'd be greater than any pastor or pope or whatever, bishop or whatever you think the really high up folks are. That would later come from Abraham's descendants. And then Hebrews points us beyond Melchizedek to Jesus. And here's the point. Jesus is the greater priest. Jesus is the eternal priest. He's the one whose priesthood does not depend on the tribe of Levi, on human. He's outside of that. He's both king and priest. Jesus is the one who fulfills what Melchizedek only foreshadowed. So why even bring up Hebrews 7 and we're talking about tithing, right? Even it says tithe in there, but it's not about it. But what Hebrews reminds us is that the tithe before the law is not merely about money. It is about recognizing the greatness of the one who blesses. It's about recognizing the greatness of the one who blesses. Abraham gave a tenth to Melchizedek because Melchizedek stood before him as a priest, a representative of the God Most High, the one who pronounced blessing and pointed Abraham to the God who delivered him. But Melchizedek points us to someone greater, points to Jesus. So if Melchizedek was great, Jesus is greater. If Melchizedek blessed Abraham, Jesus blesses his people eternally, even more so. If Melchizedek was priest of God Most High, Jesus is our eternal high priest. And that's what the Bible paints him as. He's right now advocating on my behalf and your behalf before the Father. So think about this. If Abraham gave a tenth in response to God's blessing to Melchizedek, how much more should our lives be marked by worship, gratitude, and trust in response to what God has given us in the greater high priest, Christ? Not down, up. Because in Christ we see the fullness of God's blessing, right? God has not merely given us victory in a battle. He's not merely given us food and clothing for a journey. God has given us his Son for the ultimate winning of a battle, for the ultimate satisfaction of our souls. So our giving is not simply a response to material provision. It is a response to the God who has blessed us in the deepest possible way. All right, so here's the heart of the matter, all right? God is worthy of my first and best. God is worthy of my first and best. Before the tithe was ever commanded in the law, it appeared as a voluntary act of worship, of gratitude, and trust in response to God's blessing. This means our first question should not be, do I have to tithe? I'm not saying it's a bad question. It shouldn't be the first question. The deeper question is, do I recognize God as the giver of everything I have? Because honestly, that's what God cares more about than you obeying a rule. Is do you understand who's the provider? Do you understand why you have what you have in the first place? Abraham recognized that God gave the victory. Jacob recognized that God would have to provide for the journey. Hebrews points us to Jesus, the greater priest, the greater blessing, and the greater reason for worship. So the question becomes personal. Does my giving reflect gratitude, worship, and trust in God as my provider? Does my giving say, God, you are first. You are the source. I trust you with my future. God, everything I have comes from you. It comes from you. There's a world of difference between giving God the leftovers and giving God the first and best, right? It's like, getting your meal, and at the beginning going, hey, is there something you want? Versus eating your fill and going, oh, I'm full, you can have whatever's left. Leftover giving says, God, I will honor you if there's enough after everything else. And by the way, there's never enough because we just keep increasing what we need. First and best giving says, God, I honor you because everything else comes from you. Leftover giving says, God, I trust you after I feel secure. First and best giving says, God, I trust you as my security. Leftover giving says, God, you're part of my life. But first and best giving says, God, you are Lord of my life. That is what we see in Abram. Abram gives a tenth to Melchizedek, and then he refuses the wealth of Sodom because he wants God alone to receive the credit for his blessing. We also see these principles in Jacob. Jacob says, all that I have that you've given me, I give a tenth to you. He's learning that everything he needs must come from God's hand. And that is what Hebrews points us to. Jesus is greater than Melchizedek. He's our eternal priest. He's the one whom we've received the greatest blessing. Therefore, our response should not be reluctant, minimal, or forced out of guilt. It should be voluntary worship. So the question should not be, how little can I give and still be obedient? right? It's kind of like, I don't know if you remember, but when your parents used to ask you to do a chore or clean your room, it's like, okay. For most of us, some of y'all were like OCD. Good for you. But for most of us, it's like, what could I get it all underneath the bed and then they get off my back, right? But the better question is, how can I honor God as the giver of everything I have? The question is not, do I have to tithe? It's, does my giving show that I trust God? The question not is what percentage is required, but does God have the first place in my heart? Does my treasure show that? God is worthy of my first and best not because he is needy or because he is lacking or because he's trying to take from us. God is worthy of our first and best because he is the Lord Most High. He's the one. All of heaven and all of earth are actually his. It's his. We're just entrusted with this, including, by the way, your children. God is the one who delivers. God is the one who provides. God is the one who blesses. He's the one who keeps us on the journey. He's the one who keeps us safe and gets us home safely, our heavenly home safely. He's the one who's given us Jesus. The tithe before the law teaches that giving is not first about obligation. It is about worship. Abraham's tithe says God gave the victory. Jacob's tithe says God will provide for the journey. Hebrews says Jesus is the greater priest who blesses forever. So, the slide you see here, let our giving say, God, you are first. Let it say, God, you are worthy. Let it say, God, you are my provider. Let it say, God, everything I have comes from you. God, I trust you. As the worship team comes up, it's going to lead us in one last song. I want to remind you that because before there was an official rule, the tithe, before it was ever commanded in the law, it was already teaching us a truth that God is worthy of my first and best. God is worthy of my first and best. And I'll just be honest with you. He wants something much more valuable than your money. He wants your heart. He wants your will. He wants your dreams. He wants your future. So if you focus on the money, you'll miss it. You won't get there. You might actually accomplish giving because you'll feel good about yourself. It'll be a box to check off. But God will not be impressed. Because the money, the giving, it could be your time. It could be the way you serve others. It is about your heart. That's what he wants. Not about the stuff itself. Will you pray with me? Father, you are God Most High. You are creator of heaven and earth. Everything we have comes from your hand. You give life, breath, strength, provision, protection, opportunity, and blessing, dear Lord. Forgive us, forgive me, Lord, for the times that we have forgotten that you are the source of it all, and we've held on to our fries tightly. Lord, like Abram, help us recognize that every victory comes from you. Comes from you, Lord. We are all privileged. We all have blessings. And we all are saved by grace. Teach us, Lord, not to take credit for what your hand has provided. Guard our hearts from trusting in the wealth of this world or allowing anything else to claim the honor that belongs to you alone. Like Jacob, meet us in a place where we feel uncertain, where we might feel weak, afraid, or far from home. Remind us that we are never alone and that you are with us. Teach us to trust you for the journey, for daily provision, for protection, for the future that you have promised, dear Lord. And above all, turn our eyes to Jesus, our greater and eternal priest. Thank you for the blessing that we've received in Jesus. Thank you That you have given us more than victory in a battle, more than a provision for a journey, but you have given us your Son, your very self, to restore us back unto you, dear Lord. That when we mess up, when we do hold on to our fries, when we do forget who you are, when we actually even curse you, dear Lord, it was at that moment that you said, you know what? I think I'm going to let my Son die in your place so that you may be restored back unto me. Thank you. So shape our hearts to respond with worship, gratitude, and trust. Make our giving a declaration that you are first, that you are worthy, that you are a provider, and everything we have belongs to you. Lord, free us from leftover faith and leftover worship. Teach us to honor you with our first and best because you are worthy. May our lives say what our lips confess. God, you are first. God, you are faithful. God, we trust you. In the name of Jesus, we pray. Amen.